Hi everyone, and welcome to our webinar today on how to use your HR data to improve inclusion in the workplace. My name is Vimla Rapidu and I'm the Head of Experience at Culture Shift. And today's session is really on how and understanding the importance of HR data and really digging into the nuance of what it can tell us and how it can show us the problems that we need to solve within our organisation. And more often than not, we have this data at our fingertips, but we're not always putting it together to tell the story of the problems we need to solve and the issues that might be happening behind the scenes. So I really hope that you enjoyed today's webinar, and as always, I'll be here for questions at the end, and please feel free to drop them in the chat throughout or save them to the end and I'll be here to answer. I hope you enjoy it. Thank you.
Culture Shift is an organisation that is building software to help people who have experienced bullying or harassment in the workplace or higher education report the incident and get the support that they need. We use an evidence-based approach to make sure that survivors get the help that they need through a survivor-centric support system. We're trying to create meaningful and sustainable change in organisations to have greater impact for the people that work there and to improve the employee experience. We do this through a four-step process of activating, listening, supporting and analysing. We activate people and empower them to report the incident, we listen to what's happened, we give them their support and we analyse the data to prevent the same incidents from happening again and understand the trends that are happening. But what we know so far is HR has a data problem. We collect data across the board, but we don't analyse it and we don't see the trends. And what happens is we end up in a situation where someone like Trump is sitting in a room full of white men making a decision about abortion, taking into consideration the lives of women without women in the room. And the reason why this is so intrinsically linked to HR and data is because the systems that we have in place, the systemic and institutionalised biases that we've inbuilt into our systems, perpetuate a problem that enable people to get into positions of power. So this image could look like your boardroom or the exec room or the decision-making room. This could be any organisation around the world, and it's an image that we see time and time again because we're not using the data that we have at our disposal to help us make decisions. Our unconscious bias gets in the way. All of our processes and procedures are steeped in unconscious bias, and that isn't a bad thing. The problem is when we don't recognise our unconscious bias. Everyone has bias. Our biases are made up of every experience that we've had, the cultures that we live in, and our brains are hardwired to have these biases to help us survive. But what we have to do is recognise them and understand that the way that they're infringing on our decision-making powers and the ability that we have to change things for people around us. Because we end up in situations where BAME people are being overqualified and underpaid for the positions that they're in. Our BAME colleagues are there in the room with more degrees, better education, but are being paid lower than their white counterparts. We put in processes in place that prevent transparency of pay in the workplace, so these conversations aren't even being had or the messages aren't being addressed. It's not until someone goes in and does a report or runs through the system that we can start to see what's happening. And we're all used to gender pay gap reporting. We're told how important it is to have gender equality in the workplace. But that hasn't manifested itself for everything else that makes us different. We don't hold our other differences in the same esteem as we do as gender at the moment. And we need to change that through data, through understanding how we can use data to make those decisions. And it's true again when we look at the recruitment process and how we sieve through applications. What this article shows is when white colleagues send in an application form with the same level of education and same level of experience as their BAME colleagues, white people are more likely to get a job or get the interview. And I can talk to this through first-hand experience. My sister took her name off her CV recently to see if it would make a difference to her getting into job interviews, and it did. She tried time and time again with over 15 years experience in her sector to apply for jobs with her name on it, and she was getting nowhere. She wasn't getting any emails back, she wasn't getting the interview. As soon as she took her name off her CV, she was getting called back left, right and centre. So this isn't just a statistic, this isn't just an experience or a news headline that is over-exaggerated or based on fallacy. This is true. This is the lived experience of people every day in 2020, let alone the historic years that we've seen. And I guarantee you'll walk into any department, any organisation, and they will say their recruitment process is fair and equal. And this is the importance of recognising our unconscious bias. Because whether we like it or not, we recruit people who we're comfortable with. We recruit people who look like us. And that makes it 10 times harder for anyone who's different to get through the door. And the statistics break this down into those different races as well. And you can see the disparity that we place on people from different backgrounds, whether it's Pakistani or South American or Caribbean. It's different for everyone. And that's actually why terms like BAME are problematic, because what we do is group BAME people, Black and minority ethnic people, into one category, where actually everyone who makes up that category is different, has a really different lived experience, and we need to take that into our consideration when we're doing our kind of analytics and data analysis. What I really want you to do, and what I really want you to take away from this talk, is go back into your organisations and sing the mantra that it's time to get comfortable being uncomfortable. Because we need to step out of our comfort zones, recognise our bias, and take on these problems head on. It means accepting that we will have been the recipient of privileges that we don't even recognise, and that the opportunities we've had to get into our positions aren't equal for everyone. But with that opportunity and with that privilege, we have a power to make a difference for the people around us. We can open up doors that had previously been shut. Because what we have seen at the moment is a huge rise in social movements, like the Black Lives Matter movement, where people have literally taken to the streets in protest around these systemic problems. And this isn't true of just race, this is true of the trans movement, which is happening at the moment. It's true of gender identity, sexuality. The world is in flux, and it's time for us as leaders to start using the tools we have at our disposal to make real, tangible change. Because what we've seen is it isn't changing. As we start to grow our recruitment processes, our HR processes, and the tools that we start to use, those tools are being built with bias in them. The technology that we're using to help us do our jobs, the computers that we're using, the software that we're buying, has inbuilt bias into the algorithms and AI that are helping us make decisions. Newer recruitment technology, it has been infected with bias, not just because it's based on historical data that proliferate the problem itself, but because the developers who are building it with their bias in mind. So that recruitment issue we talked about before of sifting through people with more European names versus BAME names is only going to get worse if we rely on algorithms to show us that that's who's better for the job, because that's what the data shows us. We need to step in and say that data isn't good enough, and we need to start collecting it again. We need to step in and understand how we can use data to help show us the problem, not show us the answer. So how has this happened? How have we ended up in this? We know that there's unconscious bias in the system, but what's made it worse? One way that this has happened is the structure of traditional organisations. So traditionally, you'll have your HR team who sits in one part of the organisation, you'll have your line managers that sit in another, you'll have your senior leadership, your exec board decision makers who sit in another part. You'll then have your operations, you'll have your development team, you'll have your staff on the ground, your customer services, all operating in silos across the organisation. As that organisation grows, those silos become even more closer knit and the walls start to get built around them. And it becomes harder for those silos to talk to one another. So your HR will continue to operate in its HR capacity and will talk to its other silos as and when it needs to, but not on a day-to-day basis. And the same will happen for your leadership team. They'll be making decisions, understanding, maybe getting data from each point, but working in isolation. The same will happen for your line managers, the same will happen for every part of the organisation. And what you start to see happening is disparate, disconnected decisions being made across the board that have an impact on the future of the organisation without a clear direction of travel, but probably all operating towards the same values. And then, to make it worse, we start to see lots of different systems and processes in play that can end up looking like a cockpit in a plane. You've got all of these levers to pull, you've got all of these pieces of technology and software that you're using to track and manage different things. So your HR team will be using a recruitment portal, or it will be tracking information through a system to understand holidays and who's taking time off and when, and who's been sick, and probably some of those protected characteristics. Then you might use a different bit of software to send out a employee survey to understand satisfaction and happiness and to do a pulse check of the organisation. But then actually your line managers might be doing that on a weekly basis and using a completely different system to understand how their reports are doing and what's going on the ground. Then your exec board might be measuring KPIs in a completely different way. And slowly but surely what you start to see is lots of different tools being used across an organisation that aren't talking to one another. And no one's trying to pull all of those bits of data together to understand the picture of the organisation as a whole. So what we do is we collect lots of data. We collect data from lots of systems, and it just exists. It exists in the plethora of that organisation and probably doesn't get looked at. Or it takes so long to analyse that by the time you've written the report or done the recommendations or have the statistics, it's outdated because half the team have already left. And I'm sure we've seen these forms before, the ones that collect protected characteristics. We collect this data usually when people are joining an organisation, but do we check it again when they've left? Or we give this information over to services and systems left, right and centre, but how important is it for the places that we work? And yes, we collect all of this data, but the crux is what we do with it. Data is only as important as the decisions we make off the back of it. It's only as powerful as the way that we analyse it and the way that we share that with the people who can make decisions. And so we all know we care about things like staff turnover, how many people are in the organisation, how many people are leaving, because that can be a really good indication of culture or happiness or changes that need to be made. We know we care about engagement because engagement is a success metrics for a good company to work with. If your staff are more engaged, it tends to mean they're happier, it tends to mean they're doing their job well, it tends to mean that they're satisfied with the way things are going. So we care about engagement. We also care about happiness. We know that happier staff do a better job, they're more likely to stay, they're more likely to recommend people, they're more likely to promote the organisation outside and be ambassadors. And we also care about bullying. We want to know if people are being discriminated against. We want to know if people are leaving because of a bully. We want to address those issues. But how comfortable are people really to talk about this in the workplace? And we know we care about promotions. We want to know who's getting promoted in the organisation and why. We want to see how those promotions look. We want to help people stay in the company and climb up that career ladder because staff turnover is expensive. But what if we flip the model? What if we added some intersectionality into this? And what if we cared about engagement by gender? What if non-binary people were less engaged than their male colleagues? What would that tell us about the working environment that they're in? Or what if we cared about happiness by age? What if older people were more happy in the organisation than young people? What if we actually see a middle-aged person being way happier in the organisation than anyone else? What does that tell us about our organisation, the culture that we're building? What does it tell us about the people we're recruiting? What if there aren't any older people in this organisation at all? What if we looked at bullying by ability? Would that show us anything? Are we discriminating against different ability bodies in ways that we hadn't anticipated? Are we cross-examining our data to show us that? Are we showing that intersectionality at all? And what if we looked at promotions by education? Are we giving more promotions to people with a better education than, say, if they didn't have a university degree or had a different educational route? Is our unconscious bias leading us to promote people with a better education or a university degree to higher positions? And what does that say about the unconscious bias that we're building into our processes? So what we really need to do is start analysing our data, because it's up to us as leaders in the space to use the tools that we already have, the massive amounts of data that exist in all of those systems and processes, and putting it together to tell us the story and reflect back on what's happening in the organisation, so that we can start making decisions on what to do next, how to prevent those problems, to start showing us what's happening. Because Because Culture Shift produced a report that showed us some of the data that exists in organisations. And 46% of people said that when it comes to diversity, their workplace wasn't doing good enough. And when we applied an intersectional lens on this, we saw that 58% of BAME people said that more needed to be done. And so what this shows us, if we had only looked through one lens at that data, we would have seen, yes, it's a problem. When we scratched the surface, we saw it was much more of a problem for BAME colleagues, and therefore more needs to be done in those organisations. And it can look even more bleak. When we looked at the conditions for working from home and people's reception to that through COVID, we saw that 48% of employees, BAME employees, were more comfortable working from home than 35% of their white colleagues. And what this tells us is that working environments aren't set up for people with different backgrounds. There is a problem with working environments for people from BAME backgrounds, and we need to do something about it. And we wouldn't know this exists if we weren't looking at the data and we weren't analysing it to see that intersectionality. And so we can't solve a problem if we don't know it exists. If we don't look at the data and applying the intersectionality and examining it through these different lenses, we won't know the problem exists and we won't be able to do anything about it. We'll continue to make the same mistakes again and again, and nothing will change. And most importantly, this is all data that you already have. This data exists in your different tools and processes across your organisation. It's just up to you now to put it together and to help tell the story that needs to be heard. And if you don't have this data already, the time is now to start collecting it so you can hold a mirror up to your organisation and see what's happening on the ground and see the reality and lived experience for people that are different to you. Because what we know, what the statistics show us, is that this kind of data and the decisions that we can make can see a decrease in absenteeism, better productivity, and better business overall. It leads to better return on investment, better innovation, and more creativity in your organisation, which leads to happier, more satisfied people. Because the world is changing, and we need to be a part of that change. The time is now to make the decisions that matter, to help us design a future that we're all happy to work in. And it is up to us to see what the data tells us and to make the decisions that matter. Thank you.
Thanks everyone. I hope you enjoyed listening to that. I'd really like to open the floor to questions, so you can either unmute or turn on your camera and feel free to ask, or please do pop them in the chat. I know that was quite a lot of information to take in at once, so happy to help in whatever way I can.
I'll just start off with a question, Vim, if that's okay.
Of course.
So one of the call to actions from your presentation just then was about getting the data out of all the different systems and start looking and analysing it. How would people actually get that data out of all those systems?
Yeah, so it really depends on what systems are being used at the moment. It's most likely that a lot of HR systems have an export data kind of functionality, and using that and working with IT teams or a data specialist to pull that out of the system and then analysing it. Often what's not put together is, as I kind of mentioned in that presentation, is there'll be lots of different systems in place. So you might have your overarching HR system, but then a different tool that you're sending out pulse surveys or climate surveys out to your staff. It's important to put those bits of information together so that you can see that whole picture. And equally, working with the specialist to get that data out. And if you don't have that data, start thinking through what systems you might want to put in place to start gathering it. So do you need to get a HR system, or would a Google form sending out to your staff do and help? But just doing it consistently, and then obviously taking into consideration kind of GDPR and data protection for those people as well.
I've had we've had a message through on the chat there, so I'll go to that one that's just come in. I've had another one directly as well. So what percentage of declaration is viable? We currently have 69% of our colleagues who have declared their ethnicity. Would you say this is robust enough?
Yeah, I would. It's also going to be telling if the people who have declared are from ethnic minority backgrounds or not. Often in the research that I found, the people who are most likely to be willing to put that data, particularly ethnic minority data, forward are people from majority ethnicity backgrounds. So people from Caucasian or white backgrounds are more likely to be upfront about their ethnicity than people from minority backgrounds because of the history of kind of bias that's ingrained in the system. So even if you kind of look at that 69% of people who are willing to submit it, and you're able to see that actually 68% of those have said that they're from white backgrounds, it kind of shows you that even at that point, there's work that needs to be done to encourage other people to feel safe and comfortable to give that data across. I would say 69% is good. I often try to get 80% of people responding, even if that's to say prefer not to say, because at least then it gives you that breakdown. And again, 69% shows you that you kind of still have 30% there that aren't willing to do it. So figuring out the problems that might exist and why people aren't comfortable giving that data across or that information in the first place. But it is a small amount, so it's kind of which other data points are important to tackle and understand within that.
Another one there that's just popped in the chat. So how does Culture Shift help on this topic and collect the data that is clearly required to be able to facilitate change in an organisation?
So Culture Shift has an analytics feature built into the software. So as part of the reporting tool, we ask protected characteristic data as part of that questions. We have a bespoke analytics tool that captures that data and enables users to cross-reference and split that data up across the questions that have been answered. So as a user, you would be able to see the breakdown of people who've experienced bullying and harassment by race or by age or by gender, so that you'd be able to see quite clearly where those problems lie.
Thank you. So the one that came direct to me was, so you mentioned about people who have experienced bullying and that there's a reluctancy sometimes to speak up on that. How much harder is it to get this data compared to, for example, data on engagement or promotions?
Yeah, it is harder to do because it's seen as a riskier topic, particularly if the processes and policies around bullying and harassment aren't clearly explained to employees. What we found in the research that we've done at Culture Shift so far with people who have experienced bullying and harassment is that they're unlikely to report it until the point where they're leaving that organisation. So they kind of wait till the end point, hand in their notice, and then are willing to explain what's going to happen. And what that tells us is there's a fear of repercussion, there's a fear of, I can't tell anyone this because I don't know what's going to happen to me. So it is a lot harder to get that information, but the more we can encourage people to report earlier on in the process, the easier it is for people to do it. So it is about really changing the culture about what it means to report and submit a kind of incident to whoever it is in the organisation that can deal with it, whether it's HR, a D&I team, or even a senior exec team, and showing what that process is and the support that's available and giving people the power to really take that on. So part of the work that we do with Culture Shift is work with our partners to implement a campaign that launches the software to then help them embed that culture change and make it easier and simpler for people to start reporting.
Thank you. Carl's asked a question. Could we transfer historical data onto your systems that we already have? So I think he's talking about there if, someone was to have culture shift in place, could data from other systems be transferred onto that?
So it's not currently something that we're able to offer, but it is something that's in our roadmap for in the future. So our dream would be that we could integrate culture shift with other software so that that data could be stored centrally into a given system. The workaround for that at the moment is exporting the data from both systems and putting it into an Excel spreadsheet and then being able to cross-reference it that way.
And out of interest, you were talking earlier about how many different systems and stuff like particularly large organizations could have in place. Do you think that that's the future, that there is one central point for all of the data that an organization collects?
I think so. I think I don't think we'll ever move away from the different systems existing, but I think we'll move to a point where, particularly with cloud-based software, that you'd be able to pull the data sets from APIs into a single place and be able to kind of cross-reference it and mash it up in lots of different ways. Because it's kind of what all the big technology companies do now, and I think that will become more and more normal for smaller technology companies to be offering as well.
I know that quite often when we do these webinars, we're asked to share in the follow-up any examples of, you know, best practice and that kind of thing. Are there any organizations that you know of off the top of your head that are doing this well and like using HR data well?
Yes and no. So I don't think there are any organizations out there that are doing it to its full capability. And unfortunately, I think when it comes to inclusion and diversity, we are in a mindset of seeing the silos and not seeing the intersectionality. So we'll look at, you know, I'm thinking back to 10 years ago when I started to talk about race as an element of diversity, and the pushback I got at that time was, no, we have to focus on gender first. We'll do gender first, then we might do race next. And I think that kind of narrative still exists in our approach to diversity. And I think that's holding back a lot of the best practice in regards to how you can do this. But I think there are some small organisations, well, there are some organisations, so Monzo are doing a really good job of using data to not only explain the decisions that they've made, but also to show where they've gone wrong, and they're really open and humble about not being good enough in their diversity and the data that backs it up as well. So they have a really good blog on how they use data to improve diversity, which is definitely worth reading. They're the organisation that springs to mind the most. I think we see examples of organisations starting to do this when they get the negative headlines and the negative press. So when things go wrong, they're more likely to look at the data and see why, rather than doing it proactively and look at the trends to prevent it from getting to that point.
I'll make sure I get that, dig out that blog post from Monzo, and I'll share that in an email afterwards. I've just had another question by direct message as well. So, given workplace culture is an emotive subject for many, what is your general experience of engagement of employees once the system is implemented? i.e., do you find that this is a problem that has been widely pushed under the carpet until the system is implemented and then it comes out?
Yeah, so I think a lot of the time when employees think of culture, they separate out kind of day-to-day working from bullying and harassment. And what it does is it means as a person you have a relationship, two different relationships, one with the organisation you're working for, and then the other with the person who might be bullying or harassing you. I think that when this, so with all the research that we've done with people who have experienced bullying and harassment, they've all said that having a system like Culture Shift in place would have encouraged them to report openly and earlier on when they were experiencing things, which shows us that there is an issue there and people want to be able to talk about it but don't have the means to. and it's often brushed under the carpet when it is spoken about. So we found that out of the people who did go on to report it, it was dealt with inconsistently. The messaging that they received wasn't of support, but was of like victim blaming. They were told that the issue was with them, not with the person who was bullying. And often the process stopped there. So I've gone to report this, but nothing else has happened because there's no two-way communication. Report and support and culture shift takes away all of that and enables people to report in a safe and secure way, and allows the report to be dealt with following the policy and guidelines of that organisation. So that communication of the process and policy is crucial to understanding the barriers to reporting in any given organisation.
Thank you. Just wanted to mention, because a couple of people have just joined from the waiting room and stuff slightly late, which is absolutely fine, because I'll share a recording of the presentation that was pre-recorded anyway. We're just doing a Q&A session now, so feel free to post any questions either in the chat box, or feel free to turn your microphone off and and camera on, and just ask questions to them. It's fine either way.
And actually, on that point of the issue being brushed under the carpet, we also found that giving people the choice about who received their report could be a make or break for people reporting. So people didn't want their report necessarily to go to their direct line manager, but also didn't want their report to necessarily go to HR. So enabling people to choose, well, actually, I think this report needs to go to the D&I team, the diversity and inclusion team, or actually, I want this report to go to the chief exec because I think they need to know about it, is one of the most empowering things we can do for employees, is to give them the choice about who receives the report and how it's handled.
Yeah, definitely. Someone's asked, can the system gather demographic data at application stage? Can it blend quantitative and qualitative data?
Again, that's something that's in our pipeline and our roadmap to do. So we're hoping that we'll be able to use kind of machine learning technology to try and blend the qual and quantitative data to tell the story. At the moment, what we can do in the system is search for keywords that will pull up reports that mention those words more often. But until we kind of flesh out the rest of that part of the system, we won't have it in place.
One thing I wanted to ask you to speak a bit more on, Vin, was how people go about actually analysing and interpreting data. So there was something in the presentation about people's experiences in the office, and BAME colleagues' experiences were a lot worse than their white counterparts, and the sort of figures showed that. But how would you then go about actually interpreting that figure and finding out why and what it means?
Yeah, so that's why the qualitative and quantitative analysis becomes really important, because the statistic can only tell us so much, but until we hear the story that goes alongside it, it's really difficult to know what the underlying cause is. And unfortunately, data can be cut in any way to tell any perspective that we want. So if we take the 69% respondent rate that came up earlier, it's kind of, in one way, that's kind of, you could swing it as, oh, well, almost 70% of people were happy enough to respond to this survey. That's amazing. But equally, you could flip it to, well, 30% of our people weren't confident enough to respond to this. So data can tell us whatever we want it to. We can flip it and cut it in any way, shape or form. But what's more telling is then going in and doing the user research or the analysis and speaking to people to then understand what's happened, why, and really putting the story alongside it.
Yeah, that makes sense. I agree. I think that's really important.
I think one of the issues that comes up quite a lot, particularly when we're talking about minority groups in any organisation, so whether it's LGBTQ or, you know, neurodiversity or anything like that, is being able to keep the information unidentifiable for people. So within a system, particularly if you're a small organisation, and it's, you know, I've worked in many organisations where I've been the only brown female. So if I were to make a report and submit a report and give that protected characteristic information over, but had done so anonymously, it would become really clear to whoever was reading it who had submitted that report. So one of the things Culture Shift works really closely with our partners is helping the information to stay unidentifiable and encouraging users of our system to redact information that can make it identifiable, and protecting the person who has submitted the report if they want to remain anonymous. And again, this comes back to the integrity of the policies that are in place and procedures that are there to help ensure the safety of the person who's submitting that report, and ensuring that it doesn't get out. Because again, the feedback that we got from people who'd experienced bullying and harassment who had gone on to report it was that they had always felt that HR had leaked it or had told someone, and that word had got round. And that's definitely a behaviour and characteristic trait that we need to kind of nip in the bud and make sure people feel safe to go through this process.
Yeah, and that was something that was a theme, wasn't it, from the research, really, that there seems to be a lot to do in terms of building that trust with HR, because I think HR are seen as being there for the organisation sometimes, rather than for the individuals that work within that organisation.
Yeah, and unfortunately, all it takes is one bad experience with HR to kind of have that image in further organisations. And I think it's really sad that that's the case we've got to, but systems like Culture Shift and having open, transparent policies are the way to kind of make sure that people have a much better and positive experience when things do go wrong.
Gemma's asked a question. So how can we start to repair the damaged reputation of HR? It's a theme that comes up again and again.
So when we're working with corporate partners in particular, we work in a co-branded platform way, so that the employees understand that this is a system that has been brought in by a third-party system in place, so that it doesn't feel like it's owned by the organisation. Which, when we did our research, tested really positively, because people felt like they felt there was more safety and trust in having a different organisation implement the software than the organisation itself. We can also start to repair that damage by building in that honesty and transparency about what happens when you submit a report. So what we found was it was kind of, people felt like they would report something and it would go into this black hole of the unknown. Like, I don't know if it's being investigated. I don't know if they're going to tell the person that I've reported. I don't know what happens to me. Do I have to go through a disciplinary? Am I going to have to go to court? Like, all of this stuff. So being really clear and open about what happens. So I submit a report anonymously. Here are the steps that are going to take place. I've told you my name. Here are the steps that are going to happen. And just making it really clear, but also putting a face to HR. So we're trying to encourage our partners to have the faces of the people who are going to be supporting the system on the system. Like, make it really clear who's going to be reading it, where they sit, what they do, what they think, and all of that kind of stuff.
We've got just under 5 minutes until we need to bring it to a close. So I'll just urge anyone again to pop any burning questions in the chat. Obviously, if you think of something after this session, then just feel free to send it in by email, and I'm sure Vim will be happy to answer.
Absolutely.
And yeah, I didn't know if you, Vim, had anything particularly that you wanted to, I don't know, kind of leave people with as a takeaway.
I think when we think about data, and particularly using it for understanding problems and storytelling, it can feel really complicated and scary, but it doesn't need to be. It can be really simple in how we break it down and pull together a graph to show us what's happening. And it's one of the things where not the more people, but sharing that across an organisation can help bring different perspectives into what's happening. And I think we also have sometimes fallen into a culture where we don't want everyone to know what's happening in that organisation. But the more we can share openly, the better it is for everyone and the more secure people feel. So when we start to see these problems arising and see these trends taking place, it's about translating and communicating that back to employees to show that we know there's something going on, but here's what we're doing about it. And also hopefully encouraging more people to share their stories as well.
Mark's just asked a question. So from a practical and technical standpoint, bringing in any new software can present problems. How easy is the onboarding and the storage of ever increasing data?
So with Culture Shift in particular, our data is stored in the API, so it won't ever be an issue for the organisation. And we take data and security really seriously, so we make sure that's completely protected and safe. I think that the more that's being cloud-based, the better it is, because I think it's less prone to attacks and it's easier to manage, particularly with understanding how to redact it and knowing when the information needs to be redacted and taken out as well, so that it stays unidentifiable. And as I say, I think as we start to see more and more software providers moving to cloud-based systems, this is just going to get easier and easier to do. I hope, anyway.
Okay, great. Well, I think if there's no more questions, we can wrap it up quite nicely there. Thank you so much for that, Pim. It was great, and yeah, I hope everyone really enjoyed the presentation. Like I say, I'll share a recording afterwards, and the resources that Bimla mentioned as well in the Q&As.
Thanks, everyone. I hope you have a good rest of the day.